You are looking at a fighter jet that does not belong to a superpower. It is not American. It is not Russian. It is not French or British or Chinese. It was built in a country that, until very recently, had never produced a fifth-generation combat aircraft of any kind. And yet right now, in hangars outside of Ankara, engineers are finishing a machine that is making some of the most powerful air forces on the planet stop and take a very serious second look. The country is Turkey. The jet is called Khan, and if you have not heard that name yet, you are about to hear it everywhere. This is not a story about a developing nation copying someone else's homework. This is the story of a country that was cut off, sanctioned, blocked from buying the jets it wanted, told it could not sit at the table, and then decided to build its own table from scratch. It is a story about industrial ambition, geopolitical defiance, and a fighter jet that has already flown, already broken the sound barrier, and is already sitting inside a program that Turkey plans to field by the early 2030s. But here is the part that makes this story genuinely complicated. Turkey is a NATO member. It has been since 1952. It sits at one of the most strategically critical corners of the alliance, controlling access to the Black Sea, bordering Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Georgia, and hosting American nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base. Turkey is not some outsider rattling a sword. It is supposed to be a partner, an ally, a teammate. And yet, right now, behind closed doors, NATO planners and American defense officials are asking a question they never expected to ask about a member state. What happens when an ally builds its own stealth fighter, shares defense technology with rivals, and starts making its own rules about where its jets can fly and who they can be sold to? Before we go any further, take a second right now to subscribe. More than 98% of the people watching this video are not subscribed. It is completely free, and it means you will never miss a story like this one. Hit that button right now, and let's get into it. To understand why Khan exists, you have to go back to the decision that started everything. For years, Turkey was a partner nation in the F-35 Lightning II program. Turkish companies were manufacturing components for the jet. Turkish pilots were being trained. Turkey had placed an order for over 100 F-35s and was expecting delivery. This was going to be the backbone of Turkish air power for the next several decades. Then in 2017, Turkey made a purchase that changed everything. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan signed a deal to buy the Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile system. From the American perspective and from the NATO perspective, that decision was not just a political problem, it was a technical catastrophe waiting to happen. The S-400 is designed specifically to track and target NATO aircraft, including the F-35. If Turkey operated both systems simultaneously, the fear was that Russian sensors embedded in the S-400 would collect data on how the F-35 behaves, its radar signature, its flight characteristics, and feed that information back to Moscow, potentially compromising every F-35 flying anywhere in the world. Washington warned Turkey. NATO warned Turkey. Erdogan proceeded anyway. In July of 2019, the United States officially removed Turkey from the F-35 program. The jets Turkey had paid for were never delivered. The manufacturing contracts were canceled. And Turkey found itself in a position it had never anticipated. The most capable fighter jet in the world had just been taken off the table, and the Air Force that was supposed to fly it was left holding nothing but aging F-16s. Some nations in that situation would have gone back to the negotiating table. Some would have accepted the consequences, adjusted their foreign policy, and tried to find a way back into the program. Turkey did something different. Turkey decided to build the jet itself. The program had actually existed in early form since 2011, under the name TFX, the Turkish Fighter Experimental Project. But after the F-35 expulsion, funding was accelerated, priorities were reshuffled, and the project was given an urgency it had never had before. Turkish Aerospace Industries, known as TAI, became the lead contractor. The program was rebranded Khan, a Turkic word meaning sovereign ruler or supreme leader. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not just a defense project. It was a national statement. The jet that emerged from that project is genuinely impressive on paper. Khan is a twin-engine, single-seat, multi-role combat aircraft designed for air superiority and ground attack missions. It sits in the same general weight class as the F-22 Raptor, heavier and larger than the F-35. It has a wide fuselage, twin-canted tail fins, a blended wing body design with internal weapons bays, and a shape that is very clearly designed with low observability in mind. Stealth, in other words. The aircraft is designed around a domestic avionics suite that Turkey has been building for years. Radar, electronic warfare systems, cockpit displays, mission computers, all of it developed inside Turkey by Turkish engineers. The weapons it is intended to carry, the Gökdogan Beyond Visual Range Missile, the Bozdogan Within Visual Range Missile, the SOM cruise missile, are all domestically produced. The goal from the beginning was a fighter jet where Turkey does not depend on anyone else for any critical component. Khan conducted its first flight on February 21, 2023. It flew. That sounds simple, but it is not. Most countries that have tried to build a fifth-generation fighter have stumbled hard. Japan's ATD-X demonstrator flew, but never became a production aircraft. South Korea's KF-21 Boramae is still in testing and relies heavily on foreign engines. India's Tejas has been in development for over 3 decades and is still not fully operational. Turkey managed its first flight in under 12 years from concept to taxiway. The aircraft broke the sound barrier during testing. It has completed multiple successful flights, and Turkey has already announced plans for a 2-seat trainer variant and a naval variant that could operate from their new amphibious assault ship, TCG Anadolu. But here is where the story gets complicated in the best possible way, because Khan is not finished. And the biggest problem it faces right now is the one problem Turkey cannot solve by itself, no matter how much engineering talent it has, and no matter how much money it throws at the challenge. The engines. Khan was designed around the General Electric F110 turbofan engine. That is an American engine. It is the same engine that powers some variants of the F-16 and the F-15. Turkey currently uses it in its existing F-16 fleet. The problem is obvious. If Turkey is building Khan because it does not want to depend on foreign suppliers for critical systems, then building its mission backbone around an American engine is not a long-term solution. Washington can cut off engine supplies the same way it cut off the F-35 program. One political decision, and Khan is grounded. Turkey knows this. TAI and Roketsan, Turkey's defense rocket and missile manufacturer, along with TEI, the Turkish engine industries company, have been working on a domestic engine program called the TS-1400 turboshaft and a larger effort under development to produce a turbofan that could eventually power Khan. But engine development is one of the most demanding engineering challenges in existence. The United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and a small handful of other countries have mastered it over decades of research and billions of dollars of investment. The metallurgy required to produce turbine blades that spin at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute in temperatures that would melt most metals is not something you achieve quickly. As of now, the domestic engine program for Khan is not ready. The timeline for a fully domestic propulsion solution is estimated to stretch into the late 2020s at the earliest, and even that timeline is considered optimistic by independent analysts. Until that engine exists and is proven, Khan flies on American power, and that is a vulnerability Turkey is acutely aware of. But here is something that makes NATO planners even more uncomfortable than the engine question, because the engine question is, at its core, Turkey's problem to solve. The next question belongs to everyone. Who else is Khan going to be sold to? Turkey has an aggressive defense export strategy. Its Bayraktar TB2 drone is now famous for being one of the most commercially successful armed drones in history. It has been used in conflicts in Libya, Syria, Azerbaijan, Ethiopia, and Ukraine. Turkey sells weapons to customers that many Western nations will not touch, not because they are reckless, but because Turkey has made a deliberate decision to operate its defense industry outside the framework of Western export controls. Khan is not a drone. It is a fifth-generation stealth fighter. The implications of selling it to the wrong customer are exponentially more serious, and Turkey has not made any binding commitments about who Khan will and will not be sold to. Pakistan is one of the most frequently discussed potential customers. The two countries have deep defense ties. Pakistan already operates the JF-17 Thunder with China and has been looking for a next-generation fighter to supplement its F-16 fleet. A Pakistani Khan acquisition would instantly expand Turkish military reach into South Asia and would put a NATO-allied platform, at least in its design DNA, in the hands of a country that has historically complicated relationships with India, Afghanistan, and the United States. Other names that analysts have raised include Azerbaijan, which has been a consistent buyer of Turkish defense systems, several Gulf states that are looking to diversify their defense procurement, and potentially even some African nations that Turkey has been courting aggressively as part of its broader foreign policy expansion. Now, NATO has no formal mechanism to stop Turkey from selling its own domestically produced fighter to foreign customers. That is the core of the problem. If the United States sells an F-35 to a foreign partner, there are ironclad end-user agreements, technology controls, operational restrictions, and the ongoing leverage of needing American contractors for maintenance and support. When Turkey sells Khan, none of those controls apply. Turkey wrote the software. Turkey built the airframe. Turkey controls the supply chain. The jet belongs entirely to Ankara, and Ankara answers to no one on the question of who gets to buy it. From a NATO planning perspective, that is a scenario that has no good precedent. The alliance has dealt with members that disagreed on politics. It has dealt with members that maintained independent foreign policies. It has even dealt with France, which withdrew from NATO's military command structure for over 4 decades. But it has never had to deal with a member that built its own stealth fighter from scratch and retained full sovereign discretion over where it goes. And this brings us to the deeper tension that sits underneath all of it. The tension between Turkey's identity as a NATO member and Turkey's identity as a rising independent military power with its own ambitions. Turkey under Erdogan has pursued a foreign policy that the Western alliance finds genuinely difficult to categorize. Turkey is a NATO member that bought Russian air defense missiles. Turkey is an American partner that has opened its territory to Russian energy pipelines. Turkey was a candidate for European Union membership for decades, and that process has now effectively collapsed. Turkey has intervened militarily in Syria in ways that put it at direct odds with American and European policy, and Turkey has maintained a diplomatic and commercial relationship with Russia, even as the rest of NATO imposed sweeping sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine. Erdogan himself has described Turkey's foreign policy approach with a phrase that has become something of a guiding doctrine. Turkey is a global power with strategic autonomy, not a vassal of Washington, not a subordinate of Brussels, a sovereign country with its own interests that it intends to pursue aggressively. Khan is the physical embodiment of that doctrine. It is not just a fighter jet. It is a message written in aluminum and carbon fiber and turbofan exhaust. It says that Turkey can build what it needs, can fly what it builds, and does not require permission from anyone to do any of it. NATO, to be blunt, does not know what to do with that message. Let's talk about the military reality, because the geopolitical narrative is important, but the technical picture matters just as much. Khan, when it reaches initial operational capability, will be facing a regional threat environment that is genuinely complex. Russia's Su-57 Felon is Turkey's primary fifth-generation concern in a theoretical peer conflict scenario. Greece, with whom Turkey has had decades of tense aerial confrontations over Aegean airspace, operates the F-16 and has been pushing hard to acquire the F-35. If Greece gets F-35s and Turkey is flying Khan, the Turkish Air Force will effectively be going up against American stealth technology, flown by a NATO neighbor with whom it has an active territorial dispute. That is not a hypothetical. Greek and Turkish fighter jets have been conducting dangerous intercepts over the Aegean Sea for decades. There have been mock dogfights, there have been accidents, there have been fatalities. The introduction of fifth-generation aircraft into that already volatile equation is something that defense analysts in Brussels think about very carefully. The Turkish Air Force is also operating an aging F-16 fleet that is beginning to show its age. Turkey requested an upgrade package for its F-16s from the United States, specifically the Block 70 modernization that would bring its jets closer to current generation capability. The Biden administration eventually approved that sale, but it took years of diplomatic wrangling and congressional opposition, largely driven by concerns about Turkey's S-400 purchase and its human rights record. The delay itself illustrated exactly why Turkey is so motivated to build Khan. Even its most basic procurement requests had become politically complicated. Khan solves that problem permanently. If Turkey produces its own fifth-generation fighter at scale, it does not need Washington's permission to upgrade it, to arm it, to fly it, or to sell it. The entire dependency chain disappears. And here is a number that puts the ambition in perspective. Turkey is currently planning for an initial Khan production run of approximately 20 aircraft in the first tranche, with a total program objective of over 100 jets for the Turkish Air Force alone. Export sales would add on top of that. At full production rate, TAI believes it could produce several dozen aircraft per year. For context, that would make Turkey one of the highest volume producers of advanced combat aircraft outside the United States, Russia, and China. But to get there, Turkey needs the domestic engine. And to get the domestic engine on the timeline that makes Khan relevant in the 2030s threat environment, Turkey may need help, and that is where things get very interesting. Turkey has been in conversations with multiple potential engine partners. Rolls-Royce in the United Kingdom has been discussed. The British are developing their own next-generation fighter under the Global Combat Air Program with Japan and Italy, and there has been some speculation about whether Britain might supply engine technology to Turkey as part of a broader commercial arrangement. Ukraine, which has significant aerospace manufacturing history through its Ivchenko Progress Engine Design Bureau, has also been discussed as a potential partner, though the ongoing war has obviously disrupted that calculus considerably. But the name that should make every NATO planner sit up straight is the one that has appeared in Turkish press reports and in analyst papers as a theoretical possibility: Russia. Turkey has already bought Russian air defense missiles. It has maintained economic ties with Russia throughout the Ukraine war. Russia has been exploring opportunities to deepen its relationship with Turkey as a way of creating a wedge inside the NATO alliance. A scenario in which Turkey accepted Russian engine technology for Khan, perhaps through a joint development arrangement or a licensed production deal, would represent something that NATO has genuinely never had to deal with before. A fifth-generation stealth fighter inside the alliance with Russian propulsion technology. That scenario is, at this point, speculative. Turkey has publicly stated that its preference is a fully domestic engine solution. There are strong reasons why Russian propulsion would create technical and operational problems that Turkey itself would not want. The political backlash from NATO allies would be severe, and the operational reality of flying a stealth jet with an engine that Russian engineers helped design creates intelligence vulnerabilities that would concern the Turkish military's own security apparatus. But the fact that the conversation exists at all, the fact that analysts are writing seriously about it as a possibility, tells you everything you need to know about where the alliance relationship currently stands. Let's pull back for a moment and look at the broader picture, because Khan does not exist in isolation. It is part of a much larger transformation in Turkey's defense industrial base that has been building for 20 years and accelerated dramatically in the last decade. Before 2000, Turkey was almost entirely dependent on foreign suppliers for its defense needs. It bought American tanks and upgraded them under license. It flew American jets. It used American communication systems. Its entire military inventory was essentially a reflection of Washington's generosity and NATO's collective procurement decisions. Starting in the early 2000s, Turkey made a strategic decision to change that. Defense industrialization became a national priority. The Presidency of Defense Industries, known by its Turkish acronym SSB, was empowered and funded to coordinate a comprehensive program of domestic capability development. Companies like TAI, Roketsan, Havelsan, Aselsan, and STM became the backbone of a defense ecosystem that today exports over $4 billion worth of military equipment per year. The results are remarkable. Turkey today produces its own armored vehicles, including the Altay main battle tank. It produces its own artillery systems. It produces its own electronic warfare platforms. It produces its own armed drones, which, as already noted, have proven themselves in actual combat. It builds its own frigates and corvettes. And now it is building its own stealth fighter. This transformation did not happen by accident. It happened because Turkey looked at what happened with the F-35 and the S-400, how quickly a partner country could use defense dependency as a political lever, and decided that the only real strategic security was the ability to build and operate its own equipment without anyone else's permission. From a Turkish national security perspective, that logic is completely sound. The problem is that it creates a Turkey that is increasingly difficult to manage as an alliance partner, because the levers that NATO members typically use to influence each other's behavior, defense contracts, technology sharing, access to advanced systems, lose their power when the other party can build those systems itself. You cannot threaten to cut off Turkey's access to advanced fighter technology when Turkey is building its own advanced fighter. Now let's talk about the thing that gets discussed the least in most mainstream coverage of Khan, and that is the human story behind the aircraft. Because ultimately, this jet was not built by political decisions or budget line items. It was built by engineers. Turkey has invested heavily in aerospace engineering education for decades. The Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Istanbul Technical University, and a network of technical programs across the country have been producing aerospace engineers at scale. Many of them studied abroad, at American universities, at British and German institutions, at French engineering schools, and then came home specifically to work on programs like Khan. The defense industry built a culture that made returning attractive by offering competitive salaries, meaningful projects, and the rare opportunity to work on something that had never been done before in their country. The engineers who designed Khan's airframe did not have a template to copy. They had to develop their own computational fluid dynamics models, their own structural analysis tools, their own manufacturing processes for advanced composite materials. The team that designed the cockpit display systems was building human-machine interface technology from scratch. The radar team was developing an active electronically scanned array, an ASA radar, which is among the most technically demanding electronic systems in existence. These are not small achievements. These are the kinds of capabilities that most aerospace nations never develop, not because they lack the money, but because they lack the deep institutional knowledge that can only be built over years of sustained effort. Turkey built it anyway. And here is what that means for the long term. Khan, whatever its ultimate operational capability turns out to be, represents the moment when Turkey joined an extraordinarily exclusive club. The countries that can design, build, test, and fly their own fifth-generation combat aircraft number fewer than you can count on one hand. The United States did it with the F-22. Russia did it with the Su-57, China did it with the J-20, Japan, South Korea, India, and others are still trying. Turkey, a country that was not in that conversation 10 years ago, flew a fifth-generation design in 2023. That is not a political statement. That is an engineering reality, and it has permanent implications for Turkey's status in the global defense hierarchy, regardless of what happens with NATO, regardless of what happens with S-400 negotiations, regardless of what any American president or European commissioner decides to do about it. Let's talk about the timeline, because this matters enormously for understanding how serious the Khan threat to NATO's internal coherence actually is. Turkey's current plan calls for Khan to achieve initial operational capability, meaning a small number of jets are delivered and declared combat-ready, sometime in the late 2020s, potentially around 2028 to 2029. Full operational capability, meaning the Turkish Air Force has a complete frontline squadron equipped with the aircraft, is targeted for the early 2030s. That timeline depends on several things going right. The domestic engine program needs to deliver on schedule, which, as we have discussed, is far from certain. The avionics and software integration, which is notoriously the hardest part of any modern fighter program, needs to reach the maturity level required for combat operations. The production facilities at TAI need to be scaled up, and the Turkish Air Force needs to develop training programs, maintenance infrastructure, and operational doctrine for an aircraft type that has never existed before. Each of those challenges is real, and none of them are trivial. Western analysts who have studied the program generally believe that Turkey is likely to face delays. They point to the engine situation as the most likely bottleneck, and suggest that the early 2030s for full operational capability is probably an optimistic projection. But here is the counter-argument. Turkey has surprised people before. The TB2 drone was dismissed by many Western analysts as a glorified toy until it started killing tanks in Libya and artillery systems in Nagorno-Karabakh and air defense batteries in Ukraine. Turkish program managers have a track record of delivering systems that skeptics said they could not build. Discounting Khan because of the challenges it faces is probably the wrong intellectual bet. And even if Khan is delayed by 3 or 4 years, it still arrives. The jet still flies. Turkey still has its own fifth-generation fighter. The geopolitical equation still changes. Delays are a problem of timing, not of ultimate outcome. Now let's bring this back to the NATO question, because that is ultimately where the stakes are highest. NATO is, at its core, a collective defense alliance built on trust, interoperability, and shared intelligence. Its strength comes not just from the combined military might of its members, but from the assumption that members are working toward compatible strategic goals, sharing information honestly, and building military capabilities that can operate together seamlessly. Turkey sits inside that framework very awkwardly right now. The S-400 purchase remains unresolved. Turkey still has the system. It has reportedly not been fully activated, at least not in a way that Western intelligence agencies can confirm, connects it to Russian data networks, but it has not been disposed of or returned. It sits in storage, a symbol of the unresolved tension that Turkey and the rest of the alliance have decided, by mutual if unstated agreement, not to force to a crisis. The F-35 exclusion is permanent, unless there is a fundamental change in the S-400 situation. American officials have said clearly that Turkey will not be readmitted to the F-35 program while it holds the Russian missile system. Turkey shows no signs of parting with the S-400. That impasse has been frozen in place for years and could remain frozen indefinitely. The Khan program, meanwhile, is moving forward. The more capable Khan becomes, the less Turkey needs the F-35 conversation to be resolved. There is a point in the not-too-distant future where Turkey's own fighter jet makes F-35 access irrelevant to Turkish air power planning. At that point, the last remaining leverage that the alliance holds over Turkey's aerial ambitions disappears completely. And then there is the interoperability question, which is less dramatic than the geopolitical narrative, but actually more important in practical terms. NATO's ability to conduct coalition air operations depends on a shared set of communication protocols, identification friend or foe systems, data link standards, and operational procedures. Every NATO fighter jet speaks a common technical language. They can share radar tracks. They can coordinate targeting. They can deconflict airspace in real time during fast-moving combat operations. That common language is what allows a French Rafale and an American F-16 and a Norwegian F-35 to operate in the same airspace without shooting each other down. Khan's communication systems and data link architecture have been developed domestically by Turkey. Whether those systems are fully compatible with NATO's Link 16 data link standard, whether Khan's IFF systems will work cleanly with Allied aircraft, whether the jet's electronic warfare systems will interfere with or be confused by NATO platforms, these are technical questions that have not been publicly answered in any authoritative way. They may well be answered satisfactorily. Turkey has every incentive to ensure Khan can operate with its allies, because a fighter that cannot communicate with partner aircraft is dramatically less effective in the coalition scenarios Turkey is most likely to face. But the fact that we do not know the answers yet, the fact that Khan was developed outside the collaborative framework that normally produces Allied-compatible equipment, means that NATO planners have to plan for uncertainty. And in military planning, uncertainty about an ally's capabilities is almost as uncomfortable as certainty about an adversary's. Here is something else that deserves serious attention: the intelligence dimension. Modern fighter jets are extraordinarily data-rich environments. Khan's sensors, its radar, its electronic intelligence collectors, its communications intercepts, all of that feeds into a mission computer that processes an enormous amount of information about the electromagnetic environment around the aircraft. That data has immense intelligence value. It tells you what radars are in the area, what frequencies they operate on, what their pulse characteristics look like, how advanced the enemy's electronic systems are. When an American F-35 collects that kind of data, it flows into a carefully controlled intelligence architecture where American and Allied analysts can use it to refine their understanding of adversary systems. The data stays inside a trusted network. When Khan collects similar data, it flows into Turkey's intelligence systems, systems that are not fully integrated with NATO's intelligence sharing architecture and that are not subject to the same oversight mechanisms. Turkey is not an adversary. Let's be absolutely clear about that. Turkey is a NATO member, with treaty obligations and a long history of alliance contribution. But intelligence sharing within the alliance has always been tiered. Not every member gets access to everything, and the degree of trust that determines where you sit in that hierarchy depends on confidence that your systems are secure and that your intelligence will not flow to parties outside the alliance. Turkey's relationship with Russia, with Iran, with countries that are actively working against NATO's interests in various theaters, creates legitimate questions about the security of data that Khan might collect in a coalition environment. Those are not comfortable questions to ask about an ally, but they are questions that responsible alliance managers have to ask. The broader story here is one of a NATO alliance that was designed for a world that no longer fully exists. NATO was built in 1949 to counter Soviet power in Europe. Its members were Western liberal democracies with broadly compatible political systems, economies, and strategic interests. The addition of Turkey in 1952 introduced the first major exception to that template, a country that was strategically indispensable but politically distinct. Turkey's value, controlling the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, flanking the Soviet Union from the south, providing bases for American nuclear weapons, was so obvious and so great that its political distinctiveness was managed rather than resolved. The Cold War's end, the expansion of NATO eastward, the rise of more assertive nationalism across Europe, and the emergence of genuinely multipolar global competition have all combined to create an alliance that is more diverse, more internally contested, and more difficult to manage than it has ever been. Turkey in this environment is not an anomaly. It is an extreme expression of a broader trend. Every major NATO ally is conducting a national interest calculation that did not exist in the same way during the Cold War. Germany is rebuilding its military while managing its dependence on Russian energy. France is pursuing strategic autonomy from both the United States and NATO structures. Hungary is maintaining warm relations with Moscow that infuriate its partners. And Turkey is building a stealth fighter and selling armed drones to anyone who will pay for them. The alliance is holding together, but the glue is more strained than it has been at any point since the Cold War's end. Khan is one data point in that larger picture. But it is a particularly vivid one, because it is large and loud, and it flies, and it represents a capability that cannot be recalled once it exists. Let's talk about the scenarios that defense planners actually lose sleep over. Not the theoretical long-term scenarios, but the specific near-term situations that could put Khan at the center of a genuine alliance crisis. The most immediate and realistic scenario is Turkey selling Khan to a customer that NATO considers hostile or destabilizing. As we have discussed, Pakistan is the most frequently cited candidate. A sale to Pakistan would not violate any NATO rule, because there are no NATO rules that govern the sale of domestically produced Turkish military equipment. But it would create enormous political friction, particularly with the United States and the United Kingdom, and it would put fifth-generation airframe design technology into a country that is outside the Western alliance framework and that has historically concerning nuclear weapons protocols. A second scenario is one where Turkey uses Khan export sales as a geopolitical tool to build influence in regions where NATO and Turkey have competing interests. The Middle East is the obvious theater here. Turkey and the United States have repeatedly clashed over Syria, over Iran, over the role of Kurdish forces in regional security. Turkish support for groups that Washington opposes, and American support for groups that Ankara considers terrorist organizations, has created genuine friction. Khan exports to Gulf states shopping for advanced air power could become a way for Turkey to build relationships and dependencies in a region where it wants influence, independent of what NATO would prefer. A third and more dramatic scenario involves a direct confrontation between Turkish and Greek military forces. Greece and Turkey have come dangerously close to armed conflict before, most notably in 1996, when a dispute over an uninhabited Aegean island nearly triggered a shooting war. Both countries are NATO members. The alliance has no mechanism to adjudicate their territorial disputes and has historically struggled to prevent their confrontations from escalating. If Khan enters service and Greece is flying F-35s, you have fifth-generation aircraft from two NATO allies in an active territorial confrontation. The political and military complexity of that scenario defies easy analysis. None of these scenarios are certain. Some of them are unlikely, but all of them are possible. And their possibility exists specifically because Khan is a real program, producing a real aircraft that a real air force is going to fly. Here is what makes Turkey's situation genuinely unique in the history of the alliance. Previous NATO members that caused headaches, France during its decades outside NATO's military command, Greece and Turkey during their periodic crises, Hungary in the post-Orban era, all of them were headaches that the alliance managed primarily through diplomatic and political tools. The core military relationship remained intact because all of them ultimately depended on American and NATO defense technology for their military capability. Turkey is in the process of removing that dependency. When Khan reaches full operational capability, and when Turkey's domestic engine program matures, and when Turkish defense industries complete the full ecosystem of sensors, weapons, electronic warfare systems, and logistics support that a self-sufficient fifth-generation program requires, Turkey will have a military capability that does not need the alliance's blessing to function. That does not mean Turkey will leave NATO. The alliance provides Turkey with benefits: Article 5 collective defense guarantees, intelligence sharing, interoperability that have real strategic value, and Turkey's membership provides the alliance with geographic and military benefits that would be very painful to lose. But it means that the power relationship inside the alliance changes. The United States and major European members currently hold a degree of influence over Turkey's behavior precisely because Turkey needs access to American and European technology, training, and support. As that need diminishes, so does that leverage. And when it is gone, NATO's ability to shape Turkish behavior through the internal mechanisms of alliance management diminishes with it. This is the quiet worry, not a dramatic alliance rupture, not Turkey announcing its withdrawal, but a slow, structural shift in which Turkey becomes an increasingly autonomous actor operating inside NATO's legal framework while increasingly making its own strategic decisions, selling its own weapons, flying its own jets, and answering less and less to the collective will of its partners. Whether that is a bad thing or simply a natural evolution of a more multipolar world depends on your perspective. From a Turkish perspective, it looks like long overdue recognition of Turkey's status as a major power with legitimate interests that extend beyond what any alliance can contain. From a NATO perspective, it looks like a gradual unraveling of the coherence that makes the alliance more than just a piece of paper. Both perspectives are real. Neither is simply wrong. And at the center of it all, in a hangar outside Ankara, a sleek silver jet with twin engines and a design that speaks clearly of stealth ambitions, is taxiing down a runway and climbing into the Turkish sky. Khan is not finished. It has not been weaponized. It has not yet faced the crucible of combat or even the demands of full operational testing. The domestic engine remains years away. The software integration challenges are real, and they are hard. There are informed analysts who will tell you, with good reason, that Turkey is at least a decade away from having a genuinely mature fifth-generation capability. But here is what is not in question. Khan flies. Turkey built it. The knowledge now exists inside Turkey's industrial and engineering base, and that knowledge cannot be unbought, cannot be sanctioned away, cannot be made to disappear by a vote in Washington or a decision in Brussels. The fighter jet that Turkey built is real, and NATO is very quietly, very carefully, trying to figure out what to do about it. The answer, if there is one, probably does not come from confrontation. Demanding that Turkey dismantle its defense industry is not a realistic ask, and would not survive the first meeting it was raised in. Expelling Turkey from NATO would be strategically catastrophic for an alliance that needs Turkey's geography, military capability, and regional relationships more than it wants to admit. The most realistic path is a long and uncomfortable conversation about what the alliance actually means in a world where its members have genuinely divergent interests, genuinely autonomous military capabilities, and genuinely different visions of the global order they are trying to defend. Khan is forcing that conversation, not by accident, by design. Turkey has always been too large, too capable, and too strategically located to be managed like a smaller partner nation. What changes now is that Turkey has the tools to back that claim up with something more than words. It backs it up with an aircraft that it designed, built, tested, and flew. In the world of international power, that is a language everyone understands. The question now is whether NATO is prepared to listen and respond with something other than quiet worry. Because quiet worry, by itself, has never stopped an aircraft from taking off. If this story gave you something to think about, hit the like button right now and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. These are the stories that shape the world we live in, and you should not be hearing about them anywhere else first. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's keep going.